local people created WSTP in 1937. There were 8 local investors who came together, and WSTP was the 13th oldest radio station in North Carolina. They signed on the air on January 1, 1939, with the Rose Bowl from Pasadena, California. They had some opening ceremonies, and then the biggest thing they had was the ball game. Later I learned that in that ball game, my competitor, Harry Welch, who owned WSAT, was a player, as was another prominent local physician by the name of Dr. H. Newman. WSTP became an affiliate of the Mutual Broadcasting System on June 18, 1939. And I maintained all the time that I owned the station for nearly 40 years. I maintained that relationship with the Mutual Broadcasting System because I thought what they were doing fitted into what I thought the community was interested in. And I got some benefit from that too, because as the years went by, I became Mutual's oldest continuous affiliate. And so I wound up with a seat on the Mutual Affiliates Board of Governors. And that was something that was useful because they held meetings in New York or someplace and they were expense paid. I liked that. WSTP originally stood for We Serve the Piedmont. And shortly before the television, the advent of television, WSTP had studios in Kannapolis as well as they originally were in the Yadkin Hotel, which is now the Yadkin House down by the Salisbury Depot. And they moved to the Center Theater building and had some great studio facilities there. WSTP was a basic kind of radio station with the Mutual affiliation, and it served the community very well for a long time. But they did not know how to compete with television. Everybody thought that television was going to destroy AM radio. No, it didn't work that way. A man that I worked for along the way to ownership of the station was a fellow by the name of Wayne Rollins. Rollins was the kind of guy who wanted to know what was going on. He spent a lot of money with a fellow by the name of Herman Kahn, who had the Hudson think tank in upstate New York. And he had Kahn do research on what would happen to radio as a result of television. The essence of that study was that television, being a visual medium, would have its greatest impact on other visual media. And so it did. It did not have the same impact on an oral medium that radio was. The visual medium of television impacted magazines like Life and Look, and it literally destroyed them because you could show the product that they were showing in Life and Look, you could show it in color on television and in action, most importantly in action. You could show a dishwasher or a washing machine doing its job. Automobiles the same way, and that still goes on today. You see a lot of that today. The other visual impact was on concerts and circuses, events. You could get a better seat on television, and you didn't have to sit behind a pole in the nosebleed section anywhere to see an event, because television had the best seats in the house. And that was visual impact against a visual event. It also impacted newspapers in a very different kind of way. The amount of time spent reading newspapers dropped dramatically, and people gave time to watching television. Because radio had become diversified, the big set that you watched, the big old majestic radio in the living room that people watched or listened to, they gathered around it and they watched the set as you heard Amos and Andy, and you heard Gabriel Heater, and you heard the big names of the day before television took over that whole area. Well, as we began to understand visual impact, we realized radio was losing something else. It was losing the management, the engineering, the programming, the talent, the promotional people. They were literally dragooned out of radio into television because many of the broadcast companies took their best people out of radio to staff their television stations. What that did for me was create an opportunity. I knew about that study because I had worked for the man for a couple of years. And I knew about that study, and some of his people shared with me what was in that study. And I knew that when I bought the radio station, that there were things that I could do to compete, and there were things that I literally did not want to do because television was going to own that area. That's one of the reasons I went to programming for sports that was not ever going to be on television, like the small colleges that I dealt with initially, like the American Legion baseball games. They weren't going to be televised in all likelihood. Some of them have been since over the cable. But those are the kind of things that if you knew that the impact of radio was less threatened, but however the perception to the advertiser and to the listener was that nobody listened to radio after sundown. They went home and turned on their television sets and watched television every evening. They watched the news and then they watched whatever else was on. And they only had three choices: ABC, CBS, and NBC. So radio had to adapt. And one of the things that came along at that time was a guy by the name of Elvis Presley. Now, he was big on television, but he was also big on radio, because you can't watch television all day and all night, but you can listen to Elvis Presley. And he had recorded, by the time his career was over, he had recorded over 600 songs. And there were stations even in Cincinnati one that programmed nothing but Elvis. It didn't last long, but it created a buzz. The other thing that followed Elvis Presley was the boys from England, the, what do you call them?
The Beatles.
Yeah, thank you. The Beatles. You see how much I know about some of these people. I didn't allow Elvis Presley music to be broadcast on WSTP until 8 years after the man died. Why? Because his big fan base did not have any buying power. They could buy chewing gum and candy and soda pop and movie tickets and a record, but that's about all their allowance covered back in those days. And the same way with the other group. They didn't have the buying power either. They had more buzz than Elvis, but they still did not have the buying power. I didn't program their music for a long time after they were gone off of the television. I don't think it was several years after they disappeared. And there are people who are still fans of that music to this day. It was their music. But it wasn't the music that generated the kind of buying power to buy a house or buy furniture and appliances to go in the house. Like, those people didn't have the wherewithal to buy cars. They couldn't do a lot of things. They had to depend on their parents in many cases for the money that it took for them to enjoy their lifestyle. I wasn't interested in that because I didn't see the bankers rushing to support them any more than casually. The advertiser base was simply not there. If you got past the soda pop, you got past the base. I found out that people who drank beer spent more money than people who indulged in soft drinks. So those are the kind of issues that control the decision making of why we did what we did. Meantime, we were developing the sports. And then we discovered something one day about music that came as a surprise out of a conversation with some of the public school music teachers in the county. the biggest part of their effort each year was toward Christmas programs and toward programs around Easter. They would practice songs and cantatas and various things. And so we decided at Christmas we would see if we could go out in the community and record these various organizations in the schools and churches and program their music only from Christmas Eve through Christmas Day. First year we did that, instead of selling some commercials wishing you a Merry Christmas, we sold commercials announcing that the advertiser was sponsoring a church or a civic club or a school. And to our pleasant surprise, what was a costly venture to go record all these people turned out to put more than $5,000 in the bank from that kind of activity. That became a cornerstone, but it also did something else. It was an entree into all of this other music that we found that we needed for various things, because at this time that music had more stature on the AM station than anything else that we were doing on the FM station, which at the same time, congruent, we were running country music on the FM. I found that the level of music that was capable of being produced in the public school was to the level of guitar, drums, and that was about it. The level of music was the equivalent of about a maximum of 6 years exposure in the public school music system. The musicianship that can be acquired with that kind of background fitted in more with the Beatles and Elvis Presley, and some of the music that was being generated that became known as rock and roll was a different kind of music. But the genesis of that music came out of the public school music system, and the level that they were able to achieve while students were in the system was much lower. But it created an interest in music that wasn't probably as universal as it became, but nevertheless it was advantageous to many radio stations to play that. Many advertisers bought it thinking that they were going to get great results, and maybe some of them did, but if they did, they didn't get it through the primary listeners, they got it through their family, the association they had with their family. I had a great good fortune to know Dr. Millard Wilson at Catawba College, who was the chair of their business department. We were in the Sales Marketing Executives Club together, and I learned a great deal from that man about marketing, and I applied it. By the way, he's the same guy who taught people like Tom Smith at Food Lion, David Jordan at Home Savings and Loan. There were a number of others. I suspect, I don't know this for sure, but maybe Pat McCrory, the mayor of Charlotte, was in his class. But I had a friendship and association with that man that lasted for many years. We sort of exchanged information. He invited me to come and teach some of his classes because the perspective I had, generated in part from the association with him, I applied at the radio station, and I appreciated that man very much. He was a significant factor in some of the things that we did through the years at the radio station. WRDX evolved through the years, first as a country music station. It signed on the air almost at the end of the war in March 15th, 1946. the people who owned the station understood that there was going to be some kind of surge in communications, and so they took the position that even though there was a war going on, they were applying to get an FM station.